September 14th, 1944. The tropical sun hammered down on Peleliu Island, with the kind of heat that turned metal too hot to touch and made breathing feel like drowning in warm bathwater. Staff Sergeant William Hartman crouched behind a jagged limestone ridge, his throat parched, his uniform soaked through with sweat that had long ago stopped evaporating in the suffocating humidity. The thermometer at the beach landing zone had read 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade that morning. There was no shade here, just exposed coral, skeletal vegetation, and the punishing glare of sun reflected off white rock that made your eyes ache even through squinted lids. For 3 days, Hartman's unit had been pinned down in this miserable stretch of terrain, losing men to an enemy they simply could not locate. 7 Marines dead, 14 wounded, and not a single confirmed kill to show for it. The Japanese defenders were firing from positions that seemed to materialize out of solid rock, delivering precise, devastating fire, then vanishing before anyone could return effective suppression. It was like fighting ghosts, and the frustration was eating away at the unit's morale faster than the heat was consuming their water supply. Hartman had been a marksman instructor at Camp Pendleton before shipping out to the Pacific. He understood optics, understood the mathematics of trajectory, understood concealment and camouflage better than most. He had taught hundreds of young Marines how to find cover, how to spot enemy positions, how to read terrain for tactical advantage. But nothing in his training had prepared him for an enemy that could fire from positions that remained completely invisible even after the shot. The Japanese defensive network on Peleliu was unlike anything American forces had encountered before. A revolutionary system of fortified caves, interconnected tunnels, and perfectly camouflaged firing ports that turned the island's coral ridges into a death trap. The operation was supposed to have lasted 4 days. Military planners had assured the Marine commanders that resistance would crumble quickly once American forces established a beachhead. They had been catastrophically wrong. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese commander responsible for the island's defense, had studied previous engagements with meticulous care and had concluded that traditional defensive tactics, the banzai charges and desperate frontal assaults that had characterized earlier battles, were suicide against American firepower. His solution was elegant and terrifying. His forces would become one with the terrain itself. Every cave, every crevice, every fold in the coral ridges had been transformed into a potential fighting position. Firing ports were constructed to be barely visible, often no larger than a man's fist, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while remaining virtually undetectable to observers at ground level. Private First Class Thomas Riley, a 20-year-old from Boston who kept a detailed journal despite regulations against it, had written an entry the night before that captured the unit's growing desperation. "We can hear them, can feel the rounds snapping past our heads, but we might as well be fighting ghosts. Corporal Martinez got hit this morning, taken down by fire from a position we'd cleared twice already. The men are starting to believe the island itself is trying to kill us." Hartman understood that feeling. He had watched good Marines die without ever seeing who killed them, had ordered advances that turned into slaughterhouses, had called in artillery on coordinates that seemed to contain nothing but empty rock. The traditional methods were not working. Reconnaissance patrols could walk within 10 feet of an occupied position without detecting it. Air observation was useless. The jungle canopy and coral formations created natural camouflage that was almost perfect from above. Even after taking casualties from a specific direction, pinpointing the actual firing position remained nearly impossible. The morning of September 14th found Hartman gathering what remained of his squad in a shallow depression behind the limestone ridge that had become their temporary refuge. There was Riley, the young Bostonian with his forbidden journal. There was Corporal James Washington, a former hunting guide from Montana who had spent his civilian life tracking elk through mountain terrain and who understood concealment in ways that went beyond military training. And there was Corporal David Kowalski, a Polish-American from Chicago who had worked as a photographer's assistant before the war and who saw light differently than other men, understood how it moved, how it reflected, how it revealed things that wanted to stay hidden. Hartman looked at each of them in turn. These were good men, reliable men, but the strain of the past 3 days showed in their hollow eyes and the way their hands trembled slightly when they thought no one was watching. Fear was one thing. Every Marine felt fear. But this was something deeper. This was the corrosive uncertainty of fighting an enemy you could not see, could not understand, could not defeat through conventional means. "We've lost too many men to an enemy we can't see," Hartman said, his voice low and steady despite the frustration burning in his chest. "Headquarters wants us to advance, but advancing means walking into fire we can't suppress. We need to find another way." He paused, meeting each man's eyes. "Any of you got ideas? Any observations? Anything at all that might help us understand what we're dealing with?" For a long moment, no one spoke. The distant sound of artillery rolled across the ridges like thunder. Then Kowalski shifted position, squinting toward the jungle-covered slopes ahead. His face had that focused expression he got when he was thinking about light and angles. The same look Hartman had seen when Kowalski studied photographs back at base camp, analyzing shadows and exposures with the intensity of someone who understood that vision was more complex than simply opening your eyes. "Sarge, I noticed something strange this morning," Kowalski said slowly, as if testing the words before committing to them. "Just before dawn, when I was on watch, I saw a flash, just for a second, from one of those positions we marked as cleared. It wasn't a weapon flash, it was something else, like light bouncing off glass." Hartman's eyes narrowed with interest. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Kowalski explained carefully, choosing his words with precision. "The sun was just coming up over the eastern ridge, right? And for maybe 2-3 seconds tops, there was this glint, this reflection from what looked like solid rock. I thought I was seeing things at first. Been too long without decent sleep. You know? But then it happened again, same spot, and I marked the position in my mind." Washington, the Montana hunter, leaned forward suddenly, his weathered face intense. "I know what that is," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of experience. "Back home, when you're tracking game, sometimes you can spot a deer in the brush because of how light catches their eyes. If someone's got optics up there, binoculars, rifle scope, and the glass is damaged or even just angled wrong, early morning light's gonna catch it. Every time." The realization hit Hartman like a physical force. For days, they had been searching for positions that were invisible to the naked eye, scanning coral ridges for any sign of disturbed vegetation or unnatural shadows. But no amount of camouflage could completely hide the one thing every observation post required: a way to see out. And seeing out meant glass. And glass, no matter how carefully concealed, would interact with light in ways that vegetation and rock never could. Hartman felt his heart begin to race, but he kept his voice calm, controlled, as he worked through the implications. If they've got optics at every position, and they have to have optics to be hitting us with such accuracy, then every position has glass. Damaged glass. Glass that's been scratched or cracked from near misses or concussion from our artillery. That's gonna scatter light differently than intact glass. If we can systematically scan for those reflections at the right time of day, when the sun's at the right angle, we might be able to map positions that are otherwise invisible," Washington finished. Riley raised a practical concern, his Boston accent thickening slightly with stress. "But Sarge, we can't just stand out in the open scanning the ridges. We'd be cut down before we spotted anything." Hartman was already thinking through the solution, his tactical mind engaging with the problem like a puzzle that suddenly had a solution. "We won't be standing, and we won't be in the open. We'll use the terrain against them. Set up observation points where we have cover but can still see the slopes when the light's right. Early morning, late afternoon, Those are our windows. Sun will be low enough to create horizontal light that'll catch any glass facing our direction. What happened next would become one of the most methodical and effective counter-concealment operations of the Pacific Campaign. Hartman divided his small team into 2 observation groups, positioning them at opposite ends of the limestone ridge, where natural depressions provided cover while still allowing a view of the jungle-covered slopes ahead. Each team was equipped with binoculars and a detailed map of the terrain divided into a grid system that Hartman sketched out, using coordinates they had already established for artillery calls. The first systematic scan began at 1700 hours, when the afternoon sun had dropped low enough to send horizontal rays across the western face of the ridge complex. For the first 20 minutes, they saw nothing unusual. Just the endless green of jungle canopy, the gray-white of exposed coral, the deep shadows of cave entrances that might or might not conceal threats. The heat remained oppressive. Flies buzzed around their faces, sweat stung their eyes. But they maintained their positions, scanning their assigned grid sectors with the patience of men who understood their lives depended on thoroughness. Then Kowalski, whose photographer's eye had first noticed the phenomenon, spotted it. "Contact," he called out in a low voice. "Grid reference Charlie 7. Definite glass reflection. Approximately 200 meters out. Elevation may be 20 meters above our position." Washington confirmed the sighting from his position 30 meters away. "Got it. Marking it now. Looks like it's in what we thought was solid rock face." Over the next 40 minutes, as the sun continued its descent, the team identified and marked 11 additional positions. Each one appeared as nothing more than a brief flash, a momentary glint that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 seconds before the angle of light shifted and the reflection disappeared. Without knowing exactly when and where to look, these flashes would have been invisible, lost in the general shimmer of a tropical afternoon. But with systematic observation and careful documentation, patterns began to emerge. Hartman compiled the data from both observation teams that evening, cross-referencing the marked positions against their existing maps. What he discovered was both alarming and encouraging. Of the 12 positions they had identified that afternoon, 8 were in locations that had been designated as cleared after previous sweeps. The Japanese defensive network was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Positions were connected by tunnels, allowing fighters to reoccupy areas that American forces thought they had secured. But now, for the first time since landing on this cursed island, they had a method for revealing what had been hidden. That night, Hartman requested an audience with Captain Robert Morrison, the company commander who had been struggling to advance his forces against the invisible resistance. Morrison was a veteran of Guadalcanal, a pragmatic officer who had learned to value the observations of experienced enlisted men over the confident predictions of staff officers who had never been shot at. When Hartman explained what his team had discovered, Morrison listened with increasing interest. Hartman laid out the intelligence methodically. "Sir, my team identified 12 concealed positions using reflected light from optical equipment. 8 of those positions are in areas we already cleared, meaning the enemy's reoccupying or never actually vacated. I'm proposing we expand the technique. Use multiple observation teams coordinated across the company front, scanning during optimal light conditions morning and evening." Morrison studied the marked map for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "How confident are you that those reflections indicate occupied positions and not just debris or natural mineral formations?" Hartman acknowledged the limitation honestly. "I can't be 100% certain, sir, but the reflections are appearing in locations that match the pattern of fire we've been receiving. The positions make tactical sense, good fields of observation, cover, likely connections to the tunnel network we know exists. Even if some are false positives, confirming and neutralizing the legitimate positions would fundamentally change our situation." Morrison made his decision with the speed of a man who had been waiting for any viable solution. "Do it. Coordinate with the other squad leaders. Standardize the observation protocol. I want a comprehensive target list by 1800 hours tomorrow." If this works, it goes up the chain immediately. What followed was an unprecedented coordination effort. Hartman spent the morning hours of September 15th training other squad leaders in the observation technique, emphasizing the critical importance of timing, patience, and systematic grid scanning. He explained that they were not looking for obvious positions or movement, but for a specific phenomenon that would only be visible under certain conditions. Corporal Washington, drawing on his hunting experience, added crucial refinements. A glint from undamaged glass is sharp, clean, like a mirror flash. But what we're mostly seeing is different. More scattered, more diffuse. That means damaged glass. Lenses that have been cracked by near misses or constant concussion from our artillery. Damaged glass scatters light in multiple directions, which actually makes it easier to spot because the reflection lasts longer and is visible from a wider angle. Kowalski contributed his understanding of photographic optics. Different types of glass interact with light at different angles. A binocular lens, slightly convex, reflects differently than a flat rifle scope lens. If you pay attention to the character of the reflection, you might be able to determine what type of equipment is at each position. By 1400 hours, Hartman had briefed 6 additional squad leaders and established a coordinated observation network spanning nearly 800 meters of the American front line. Each observation team had been assigned specific grid sectors to monitor, with overlapping coverage to ensure no area was missed. Communication runners were positioned to relay sightings to a central compilation point where Hartman and Captain Morrison would build a comprehensive target map. The afternoon scan began at 16:30 hours. The conditions were nearly perfect. Thin clouds diffused the direct sunlight while still allowing sufficient illumination for reflections to be visible. Across the American line, Marines crouched in their observation positions, binoculars pressed to their eyes, scanning their assigned grid sectors with the patience of men who understood their lives depended on thoroughness. The first confirmed sighting came at 16:42 from an observation team 300 meters to Hartman's left. The runner arrived breathless. Definite glass reflection at grid reference Echo 12. Estimated distance 350 meters, positioned in what appeared to be a natural rock formation. Within the next hour, reports came flooding in from across the front. Each one was logged, plotted, and cross-referenced against known terrain features and previous engagement patterns. By 1800 hours, when the light had shifted too far west to continue effective observation, Hartman's compiled map showed 43 confirmed or suspected positions across the company's front. The density was staggering. In some areas, concealed positions were spaced barely 20 meters apart, creating overlapping fields of observation and fire that explained why previous advances had been so costly. Captain Morrison studied the completed map with an expression that mixed satisfaction with grim understanding. "We've been walking into a prepared killing zone. No wonder we've been taking such heavy casualties." He looked up at Hartman. "With this intelligence, we can finally do something about it." Riley, watching from nearby, wrote in his journal that evening, "Sarge figured it out. After 3 days of being torn apart by an enemy we couldn't see, we finally have a way to find them. It's all about the glass, how it catches light when everything else stays hidden. Tomorrow we test whether this theory can save lives, or if we're just fooling ourselves with hope." Hartman sat alone that night, studying the map by lamplight, understanding that they had discovered something significant, but not yet knowing whether it would be enough. The Japanese had spent months perfecting their defensive system. Could a technique developed in an afternoon by desperate men really overcome such sophisticated concealment? The answer would come with the morning sun, and it would change everything. The morning of September 15th dawned with the same oppressive heat that had characterized every day on Peleliu, but for the Marines of Hartman's company, this morning felt different. For the first time since landing on this god-forsaken island, they had actionable intelligence about what they faced. They knew where the hidden positions were, or at least where many of them were. The advantage of invisibility that had made the Japanese defensive network so effective had been significantly reduced. But knowing where the enemy was hiding and neutralizing those positions were two entirely different problems. Captain Morrison had submitted a request for preparatory fire support against the identified positions, providing precise coordinates derived from the observation data. The request emphasized that these were hardened targets requiring direct hits rather than general area coverage. At 0700 hours, the preparatory bombardment began, a carefully orchestrated 45 minutes of artillery and mortar fire that walked across the ridge complex, targeting each marked position in sequence. Hartman watched the explosions through his binoculars, feeling the concussive waves roll across the ridges even from their protected position. Coral dust rose in massive clouds. Trees shattered and fell. The noise was overwhelming, a constant thunder that made communication impossible except through hand signals. When it finally ceased, the sudden silence felt unnatural, like the world holding its breath. The real test came next. Hartman led his observation team in another systematic scan, this time looking not for new positions, but for evidence of which identified positions had been affected by the bombardment. The results were encouraging, but incomplete. Several positions that had shown clear glass reflections the previous day now showed nothing, suggesting their optical equipment had been compromised or the positions had been abandoned. But other positions remained active, the glint of light still visible at the precise coordinates they had marked. The Japanese defenders were proving adaptable. Some had already begun implementing countermeasures, covering their optics when not actively observing, adjusting angles to minimize reflection. But no countermeasure was perfect, and the American observers had learned what to look for. At 0800 hours, the advance began. Captain Morrison had restructured the approach based on Hartman's intelligence. Rather than advancing on a broad front that would expose Marines to multiple concealed positions simultaneously, he organized a methodical approach that isolated and addressed identified positions one at a time. Squads moved with fire support specifically targeted at known locations. Flanking elements approached from angles that avoided the mapped fields of fire. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Private Riley, advancing with the first element, would later write in his journal about that morning's operation with barely contained relief. It was like someone had turned on the lights. Before, we'd been moving forward into nothing we could see, just waiting to be hit from somewhere we couldn't identify. But this morning, we knew where to look. When we approached a position we'd marked, we could actually see the firing port. This tiny dark slit in what looked like solid rock. We must have walked past a dozen just like it in previous days without ever knowing they were there. The advance that morning covered ground that had been unreachable for 3 days. By noon, 31 of the 43 positions identified through the glass reflection method had been confirmed and addressed. Some had been abandoned after the preparatory bombardment. Others were neutralized through direct assault now that their locations were known. The remaining positions either contained equipment that had been rendered inoperable or had never been occupied in the first place. Acceptable margins of error given the dramatic improvement in the unit's tactical situation. But Hartman was not satisfied with a single day's success. He understood that the Japanese defenders would adapt, would find ways to counter the technique if given time. That afternoon, he convened his observation team to discuss refinements and anticipate enemy countermeasures. "We have to assume they'll figure out what we're doing," Hartman said, his voice serious. "We need to think about how we'd counter this technique if we were in their position, then get ahead of those countermeasures." Washington offered the first insight, his hunting instincts providing practical understanding. "If I were them, I'd start covering my optics when I'm not actively using them. Cloth cover, piece of vegetation over a lens, eliminates the reflection entirely." Kowalski nodded, adding another consideration. "They might also adjust their positioning, angle their optics so they never face directly toward our lines. If the lens is pointed slightly away, the reflection goes in a different direction. We'd never see it." Hartman absorbed these possibilities, already thinking through countermeasures. For covered optics, we need to catch them during active observation periods when the covers have to be removed. That means more frequent scans throughout the day, looking for brief windows of exposure. For angled optics, we use multiple observation points at different angles. Even if a position's invisible from one direction, it might be visible from another. Over the following days, the technique was refined and expanded. Hartman established a rotating observation schedule that maintained continuous coverage during daylight hours. He trained additional teams in the method, emphasizing the importance of patience and systematic scanning. He developed a standardized reporting format that allowed rapid compilation and analysis of sighting data. The psychological effect on the Marines was perhaps even more significant than the tactical advantage. For the first time since landing on Peleliu, they felt they were facing an enemy they could see, an enemy they could understand and overcome. The corrosive fear that came from fighting invisible opponents had been replaced by something more manageable, the straightforward danger of combat against a known threat. Riley captured this transformation in a journal entry from September 18th. It's strange how such a small thing could change so much. A week ago, I felt helpless, like we were facing something we couldn't comprehend, let alone conquer. But now we have a method, a way to see what's hidden, a way to respond effectively. The enemy's still out there, still dangerous, but they're not invisible anymore. And that makes all the difference in the world. Word of the technique spread rapidly through the Marine units on Peleliu. Captain Morrison's after-action reports detailed the method and its results, leading to implementation across the divisional front. Other units began reporting similar success, adapting the basic technique to their specific terrain and conditions. What had started as a desperate improvisation by a pinned-down squad was becoming standard operating procedure. On September 20th, Hartman was summoned to regimental headquarters to brief senior officers on the method. Standing before a room of colonels and majors, men with military academy educations and decades of experience, the enlisted Marine from California explained the principles of the glass reflection technique with the same clarity he had used to train his own squad. The method's based on a simple optical principle, Hartman began, his voice steady despite the intimidating audience. Glass reflects light differently than natural materials. Damaged glass reflects it even more distinctly. By systematically scanning at optimal light angles, typically early morning and late afternoon, we can identify concealed positions that are otherwise invisible. He paused, making sure every officer was following. The key elements are timing, patience, systematic coverage, and immediate documentation of sightings. Colonel Marcus Hendricks, who had been struggling with similar concealment challenges in his own sector, asked about limitations. What happens when weather conditions aren't optimal? Or when the enemy adjusts their tactics? Hartman responded thoughtfully, acknowledging the technique's constraints while emphasizing its adaptability. Overcast conditions reduce effectiveness, sir, but even diffuse light can produce identifiable reflections from damaged glass. For enemy countermeasures, we've found that maintaining continuous observation throughout the day catches positions that are only briefly exposed. No countermeasure is perfect. Eventually, we catch them. The briefing led to formal documentation of the technique and its dissemination across the Pacific Theater. Military intelligence officers interviewed Hartman and his team extensively, producing training materials that would be used in subsequent operations. The glass reflection method, or as it came to be informally known, the broken glass method, became standard doctrine for identifying concealed positions in jungle and cave defense environments. But the true significance of the technique extended beyond its tactical applications. For months, American forces in the Pacific had struggled against an enemy that seemed to possess almost supernatural abilities of concealment. The frustration and fear generated by facing threats they could not see had taken a heavy toll on morale. The broken glass method did not just provide a tactical solution, it restored the Marines' sense of agency, their belief that they could understand and overcome the challenges they faced. By late September, Hartman's company had identified and addressed over 200 concealed positions across their sector using the systematic observation technique. Casualties dropped by more than 60% compared to the previous week. The advance that had been stalled for days began moving forward again, methodically clearing the island's defensive network position by position. The Japanese defenders fought with characteristic determination, but the fundamental advantage of invisibility had been compromised. When Marines approached a position knowing its exact location, the outcome was usually inevitable. Superior firepower and tactical coordination overwhelmed defenders who could no longer rely on remaining undetected. Private Kowalski, whose initial observation had sparked the entire development, found himself in unexpected demand. Other units requested his assistance in training their observation teams, wanting the benefit of his photographer's understanding of light and reflection. He approached the work with the same careful attention he had once applied to developing photographs in his Chicago studio, analyzing angles, studying how different conditions affected visibility, teaching others to see what most people overlooked. Corporal Washington's hunting instincts proved equally valuable. He had an intuitive understanding of how concealed positions should look, where they would logically be placed for maximum tactical advantage. His ability to predict likely locations helped observation teams focus their efforts more efficiently, reducing the time required to scan large areas. And Riley continued documenting everything in his forbidden journal, creating a detailed record that would later become a primary source for military historians studying the Pacific Campaign. His entries captured not just the tactical evolution of the technique, but the human experience of Marines who had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges and had found a way to overcome them through observation, collaboration, and creative thinking. On September 25th, as Hartman's unit finally secured the ridge complex that had resisted them for nearly 2 weeks, Captain Morrison gathered the squad leaders for a brief meeting. His weathered face showed the strain of continuous combat, but his eyes carried satisfaction. "What you men accomplished here will be studied for years," Morrison said quietly. "You didn't just develop a new technique. You changed how we approach one of our most dangerous challenges in this theater. You saved lives, dozens of them, probably hundreds across the division. That matters." Hartman nodded, accepting the praise but thinking about the men who had not survived to see the technique's success. 7 dead before they figured it out. 7 Marines who had fallen to an enemy they could not see. The broken glass method had come too late for them, but it would save countless others in the battles still to come. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific and long shadows stretched across the coral ridges they had finally secured, Hartman sat with his observation team, Kowalski, Washington, and Riley, sharing a quiet moment before whatever came next. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Riley said, his Boston accent softened by exhaustion. "How close we came to never figuring this out. If Kowalski hadn't been on watch at exactly the right time, if he'd dismissed that glint as his imagination, if Washington hadn't recognized what it meant, we'd still be out there, taking casualties from positions we couldn't find." Kowalski shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just noticed something that didn't fit. That's all." "That's everything," Washington countered. "In hunting, in tracking, in any kind of observation work, noticing what doesn't fit is the whole game. Most people look without seeing. You saw." Hartman listened to his men talk, feeling a deep sense of pride that had nothing to do with rank or military achievement. These were good men who had faced an impossible situation and had refused to accept defeat. They had questioned assumptions, combined different perspectives, and found a solution that had seemed beyond reach. That kind of thinking, adaptive, creative, collaborative, was more valuable than any weapon in the Marine Corps arsenal. "The technique works because it's based on something fundamental," Hartman said finally. "No matter how sophisticated the concealment, no matter how well camouflaged the position, They still need to see us to shoot us. And seeing requires optics. And optics require glass. And glass interacts with light in ways that natural materials don't. We didn't invent some miracle solution. We just paid attention to basic physics and figured out how to use it. Riley nodded slowly, and saved a lot of lives in the process. That's the part that matters, Hartman agreed. Not the recognition or the after-action reports. The Marines who'll come home because we figured this out. That's what we'll remember when this war's finally over. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over Peleliu. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, other units still fighting, still advancing, still using the techniques that had been developed right here in this position. The broken glass method was spreading across the Pacific Theater, being refined and adapted by other Marines facing similar challenges. But for Hartman and his team, this moment of quiet reflection felt earned. They had faced the invisible enemy and had found a way to make it visible. They had turned desperation into innovation, fear into agency, helplessness into effective action. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new advances, new dangers. The campaign for Peleliu was far from over. It would continue for another 2 months, far longer than the 4 days initially predicted. The cost would be high, with casualties numbering in the thousands on both sides, but the broken glass method would save countless lives in those remaining weeks. And it would become part of military doctrine, taught to new generations of Marines, adapted to new technologies and new conflicts, but always based on the same fundamental principle that Hartman's desperate squad had discovered on a sweltering September afternoon. That careful observation, systematic analysis, and creative thinking can overcome even the most sophisticated concealment. The war had taught them many things about violence and sacrifice and the terrible cost of conflict, but it had also taught them something more hopeful, that human ingenuity, when applied with determination and collaboration, could find solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. As they sat there watching the stars emerge above Peleliu's scarred landscape, each man carried that knowledge forward. Whatever came next, they had proven something essential about themselves and about what was possible when desperate circumstances met thoughtful observation. The glint of light off broken glass had shown them the way, and they would never forget it. The campaign for Peleliu finally ended on November 27, 1944, 73 days after the initial landing. The 4-day operation that military planners had promised had become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. American casualties exceeded 10,000, nearly 40% of the assault force. The Japanese defensive network that had seemed so impenetrable at the beginning had eventually been overcome, but the cost had been staggering. Staff Sergeant William Hartman survived the campaign. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his contribution to tactical intelligence, though the citation's dry language, for developing innovative reconnaissance techniques under combat conditions, captured nothing of the desperation that had driven the discovery, nothing of the lives saved by noticing how sunlight reflected off damaged glass. The medal arrived in a small box while he was recovering from a shrapnel wound at a field hospital in the Philippines. He looked at it for a long moment, thinking about the 7 Marines who had died before they figured out the broken glass method, then put it in his footlocker and never wore it. In early 1945, Hartman was transferred back to the United States and assigned to the Marine Corps Training Command at Camp Pendleton. His combat days were over, but his contribution to tactical doctrine was just beginning. He spent the remaining months of the war teaching the observation techniques he had developed on Peleliu to the next generation of Marines. The broken glass method became a standard component of reconnaissance training, adapted and refined for different environments, but always based on the same fundamental principle. Systematic observation under optimal conditions can reveal what was meant to stay hidden. Corporal James Washington, the Montana hunting guide whose understanding of tracking and light had contributed crucial insights to the method, was wounded in late September when a mortar round landed near his observation position. The wounds were serious but not fatal, shrapnel in his legs and lower back that would cause him pain for the rest of his life. He was evacuated to Hawaii, then to San Diego, then home to Montana. He recovered enough to walk with a cane, enough to return to the mountains he loved. After the war ended, he resumed his work as a hunting guide, occasionally telling clients about the time his elk tracking abilities had helped turn the tide on a Pacific island he had never heard of before 1944. He never spoke about the friends who had not made it home, but sometimes, when the light hit the mountain forests at certain angles, he would pause and remember Peleliu, remember the desperate days when seeing the invisible had meant the difference between life and death. Corporal David Kowalski, the photographer's assistant whose initial observation had sparked the entire development, survived Peleliu without serious physical injury. The psychological scars were another matter. He had nightmares for years afterward, dreams where he searched endlessly for reflections that would reveal hidden threats, where the glint of light always came too late to save the men falling around him. But he channeled the trauma into his work. After returning home to Chicago in late 1945, he pursued his passion for photography with renewed intensity, eventually establishing a successful commercial practice specializing in architectural photography. His understanding of light and reflection, honed to life-or-death precision on Peleliu, served him well in civilian life. He rarely talked about the war, but when younger photographers asked about his technical mastery of light, he would sometimes say, "I learned to really see light on an island in the Pacific, learned that paying attention to how light behaves can be the difference between finding what's hidden and missing it completely." Private First Class Thomas Riley, the young Bostonian whose journal had documented the development of the technique, was reunited with his older brother after the war ended. His brother had been held as a prisoner in Europe and was liberated in April 1945. Thomas kept his journal for the rest of his life, eventually donating it to the Marine Corps Historical Division, where it became a primary source for historians studying the Pacific Campaign. His detailed entries captured not just the tactical evolution of the broken glass method, but the human experience of Marines who had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges and had found a way to overcome them. In his final entry about Peleliu, written in December 1944 while recovering at a base hospital, Riley reflected on what the experience had taught him. "We went to that island thinking we knew how to fight. We learned that sometimes the old methods aren't enough, that survival requires adaptation and observation and the willingness to question everything you thought you knew. Sarge and the others figured out how to see what couldn't be seen. They saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds across the division. But more than that, they proved something important, that even when you're facing something that seems impossible, there's usually a way through if you're willing to look hard enough, think differently enough, and trust that your observations matter." The broken glass method itself evolved and was refined in subsequent conflicts. During the final months of World War II, variations of the technique were used successfully on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, adapted to the specific terrain and defensive strategies encountered on each island. After the war, the basic principle that systematic observation under optimal conditions can compromise even sophisticated concealment became incorporated into reconnaissance doctrine across all branches of the U.S. military. Modern surveillance techniques, while vastly more sophisticated than visual observation with binoculars, still incorporate elements of the approach developed by Hartman and his team. The fundamental understanding that concealment is never perfect, that every method of observation requires some interaction with the electromagnetic spectrum, that patient systematic scanning can reveal anomalies that casual observation misses. These principles remain as valid in the age of thermal imaging and satellite reconnaissance as they were on Peleliu in 1944. Captain Robert Morrison, the company commander who had authorized the expansion of the technique, survived the war and retired from the Marine Corps in 1950 as a colonel. In his memoir, published in 1972, he devoted an entire chapter to the broken glass method and the enlisted Marines who had developed it. He wrote, "I have commanded men in 3 separate conflicts and have witnessed countless examples of courage and innovation under fire. But what Hartman and his squad accomplished on Peleliu stands out because it exemplified qualities that are often undervalued in military culture: careful observation, creative problem-solving, and the willingness to question established approaches when they aren't working. They didn't have advanced technology or superior numbers. They had desperation, intelligence, and the ability to see what others had missed. That combination saved more lives than any weapon we carried." In the decades after the war, the survivors of Hartman's observation team maintained irregular contact through letters and occasional reunions. They had shared something profound on Peleliu, not just the trauma of combat, but the experience of solving a problem that had seemed unsolvable, of finding hope in desperate circumstances, of proving that human observation and creativity could overcome sophisticated opposition. In 1974, 30 years after the battle, Hartman, Washington, Kowalski, and Riley gathered for a reunion at Camp Pendleton. They were older now, in their 50s and early 60s, with gray hair and slower movements and bodies that carried the accumulated wear of 3 decades since Peleliu. But when they stood together on the observation range where Hartman now taught reconnaissance techniques to young Marines, the years seemed to collapse. "They still teach the method," Hartman said, gesturing toward the training materials visible through the range office window. "Modified for modern conditions, adapted to new technologies. But the basic principle is the same one we figured out that afternoon when we were desperate and running out of options." Washington leaned on his cane, studying the training range with the same careful attention he had once applied to the coral ridges of Peleliu. "You know what I think about sometimes? How close we came to never figuring it out. If any one piece had been missing, if Kowalski hadn't noticed that glint, if I hadn't recognized what it meant, if you hadn't been willing to try something unconventional, if Morrison hadn't authorized expanding it, we'd have kept taking casualties until either we broke through or they broke us." Kowalski nodded slowly. "I still dream about it sometimes. That specific moment when I saw the reflection and almost dismissed it as my imagination. In the dreams, I do dismiss it. And everything that followed never happens. All the lives that were saved, just gone because I didn't trust what I was seeing." Riley, who had become a high school history teacher in Boston, spoke up quietly. "But you did trust it. That's what matters. You all did. You took a half-formed observation and turned it into a systematic method. You taught others how to see what you'd learned to see. That's not luck. That's something more important." They stood in silence for a moment, 4 men who had been young together in hell and had found a way to survive it through observation and innovation. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the western hills, creating the same horizontal light that had allowed them to spot reflections off damaged glass 3 decades earlier. "I've spent 30 years teaching Marines how to observe," Hartman said finally. "Every class I tell them the story of how the broken glass method was developed. I tell them about a desperate afternoon on Peleliu when we had to find a way to see the invisible or die trying. And I tell them that the most important tool a Marine carries isn't a rifle or a radio. It's the ability to observe carefully, think critically, and adapt when circumstances demand it." Washington smiled slightly. "You think they believe you?" "The smart ones do," Hartman replied. "The ones who understand that survival in combat isn't just about firepower or courage. It's about seeing clearly, thinking carefully, and being willing to try something different when the conventional approach isn't working." Kowalski pulled out a camera, a new Nikon he had been testing for a commercial project, and suggested they take a photograph together. They arranged themselves on the observation range, 4 middle-aged men whose bodies carried the accumulated damage of war and time, but whose eyes still held the sharpness of people who had learned to really see. As Kowalski set up the shot using the timer function, Riley said, "You know what we should really photograph? The actual moment when it all came together. That afternoon on September 14th when we figured it out. That's the image that matters." "Can't photograph the past," Washington observed. "No," Kowalski agreed, pressing the shutter button and moving quickly to join the group. "But we can remember it, and we can make sure others remember it too." The camera clicked. The image captured 4 men standing on a California training range in 1974. But what it really documented was something that had happened 3 decades earlier on a Pacific island where desperate circumstances had met creative observation and had produced a solution that saved countless lives. William Hartman died in 1989 at the age of 73. He had spent 45 years teaching Marines how to observe, how to think, how to see what others missed. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was attended by hundreds of former students, men who had learned reconnaissance techniques from the Marine who had helped develop them under fire on Peleliu. James Washington died in 1991, 2 years after Hartman. He was found in his cabin in the Montana mountains, his hunting rifle cleaned and ready for a season that would never come. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but focused primarily on his work as a guide and his deep knowledge of the wilderness. Only those who had served with him knew the full story of how his understanding of tracking and observation had helped change tactical doctrine in the Pacific. David Kowalski lived until 2003, dying at 81 after a long career in commercial photography. His work had been featured in architectural journals and major advertising campaigns, celebrated for its masterful use of light and reflection. But the photographs he was most proud of were the ones documenting that 1974 reunion. 4 men who had survived something terrible and had turned their survival into something meaningful. Thomas Riley lived the longest, passing away in 2008 at the age of 84. He had taught history for 40 years, using his own experiences to help students understand that history was not abstract dates and strategic movements, but individual people making choices under pressure. He kept his Peleliu journal in a safe deposit box and reread it every September 14th, remembering the afternoon when a glint of light had changed everything. The coral ridges of Peleliu are quiet now. The jungle has reclaimed much of the terrain that was contested so fiercely in the autumn of 1944. The caves and firing ports remain, slowly eroding under decades of wind and rain, silent monuments to a defensive system that had seemed impenetrable until desperate Marines figured out how to see what was meant to stay hidden. Visitors to the island can still find evidence of the battle. Rusted equipment, shattered coral, the occasional reminder of the violence that had swept across this small piece of Pacific real estate. But they cannot see what Hartman and his team saw in September 1944. The specific angle of light that caught damaged glass and revealed concealed positions, the systematic pattern of observation that transformed invisible threats into visible targets, the desperate innovation that saved hundreds of lives. The broken glass method itself has evolved far beyond its origins. Modern military forces use thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite surveillance to detect concealed positions. But the fundamental principle remains the same: that systematic observation under optimal conditions can compromise even the most sophisticated concealment, that paying attention to anomalies and patterns can reveal what others miss, that desperate circumstances often produce the most creative solutions. What began as a half-formed observation by an exhausted photographer's assistant on a sweltering September afternoon became a systematic technique that influenced tactical doctrine for generations. It stands as a testament to the power of careful observation, collaborative problem-solving, and the willingness to question established approaches when they prove inadequate. But perhaps more importantly, the story of the broken glass method reminds us that innovation often emerges not from laboratories or planning rooms, but from desperate people facing impossible circumstances and refusing to accept defeat. Hartman, Washington, Kowalski, and Riley were not scientists or tacticians. They were ordinary Marines who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and who chose to pay attention, to think carefully, to combine their different perspectives and experiences into something that had not existed before. They saw a glint of light where others saw nothing. They recognized its significance where others would have dismissed it as random reflection. They developed a systematic method where others might have settled for isolated observations, and they saved lives, dozens, perhaps hundreds, through nothing more sophisticated than careful attention and creative thinking. In military academies and training commands today, instructors still teach variations of the technique developed on Peleliu in September 1944. They talk about optimal observation conditions and systematic scanning patterns and the importance of documenting anomalies. But the best instructors also tell the story behind the technique, the story of 4 desperate Marines who refused to accept invisibility as an insurmountable advantage, who trusted their observations even when those observations seemed insignificant, who proved that the human capacity for careful attention and creative problem-solving remains one of the most powerful weapons in any conflict. The men who developed the broken glass method have all passed now, joining the thousands of others who fought and died in the Pacific. But their legacy endures in the doctrine they helped create, in the lives they saved, in the example they set for future generations facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. Sometimes the most important innovations emerge not from superior technology or overwhelming force, but from the simple act of paying attention, of noticing what others miss, of questioning what others accept, of finding patterns where others see only chaos. The broken glass method stands as proof that desperation combined with careful observation can produce solutions that change how we approach fundamental challenges. The glint of light off damaged glass revealed more than hidden enemy positions. It revealed something essential about human capacity for adaptation and innovation under pressure. It proved that when circumstances seem hopeless, when conventional approaches have failed, when the cost of continuing as before becomes unbearable, that is precisely when careful observation and creative thinking matter most. And that lesson, forged in the desperate heat of Peleliu in September 1944, remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago. The technologies change, the specific challenges evolve, but the fundamental truth endures, that seeing clearly, thinking carefully, and being willing to try something different can overcome even the most sophisticated opposition. The broken glass method saved lives on Peleliu. But more than that, it demonstrated something profound about human capability, that innovation emerges from desperation, that collaboration multiplies individual insight, that careful observation can reveal what sophisticated analysis misses, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply paying attention to what everyone else has overlooked. That is the legacy of 4 Marines who saw a glint of light and understood its significance. That is the story worth remembering, worth teaching, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges the future holds. The enemy on Peleliu was invisible until someone learned how to see, and in learning to see, they changed not just one battle, but the entire approach to confronting concealment in modern warfare. That is innovation. That is adaptation. That is what happens when desperate circumstances meet careful observation and creative thinking. That is the legacy of the broken glass method.